In the shadows of London, my name is whispered with fear. I am the enforcer, the man who breaks bones to build empires. But on November 20th, 2023, my wedding night, I realized I was the one who was truly vulnerable. I expected a cold, strategic arrangement, but when the silk hit the floor, I discovered a treasure that didn't belong in my world. She was pure, untouched, and now I'll have to kill every man I know just to keep her that way. The rain in London never felt like a cleansing force. It felt like a heavy grey curtain designed to hide the sins of the city. On the evening of October 14th, 2023, Elias Thorne stood beneath the stone overhang of a Victorian-era warehouse, watching the droplets shatter against the cracked pavement. At 34 years old, Elias was a man built from the very architecture of the East End, solid, weathered, and intimidating. He wore a charcoal wool coat, tailored so precisely it masked the tension in his broad shoulders, though it could do nothing to hide the coldness in his eyes. His hands, tucked into leather gloves, were still steady, despite the task he had just completed inside the building behind him. He wasn't a man who enjoyed violence, but he was a man who understood its utility. In the firm, he was the silent hand, the enforcer who ensured that debts were paid and respect was maintained. He had spent 15 years climbing the jagged ladder of the city's underworld, trading his youth for a reputation that kept the streets quiet when he walked them. Elias checked his reflection in a dark window. His face was a map of a life lived in the margins, a faint scar through his left eyebrow, and a jawline that looked as though it had been carved from granite. He was a common man by birth, the son of a dock worker who had died with nothing, but through sheer resilience he had become something extraordinary. He was the pillar upon which the firm's stability rested. Yet, as he stood there in the damp chill, a deep, hollow ache resonated in his chest, a conflict he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. He had everything a man in his position could want: power, money, and a fear-based loyalty from those around him. But his flat was a tomb of silence, and his nights were spent staring at a ceiling, wondering when the weight of his crown would finally crush his neck. The city moved around him with a frantic, uncoordinated energy. Red buses hissed through deep puddles, and the distant hum of the underground vibrated beneath his boots. It was a world of millions, yet he felt entirely separate from it. He was the ghost in the machine, the person people looked away from when he entered a room. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, its tires splashing muddy water toward his polished shoes. The window rolled down to reveal Arthur, the patriarch of the firm, and the man Elias had called a mentor since he was 19. Arthur was 70 now, his skin like parchment, but his eyes still held the predatory gleam of a shark. "Get in, Elias," Arthur said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "We have business that won't wait for the weather to break." Elias slid into the leather-scented warmth of the car. The interior was silent, insulated from the roar of the city. He noticed Arthur was holding a thick dossier, the edges frayed. "The merger with the Marcello Group is stalling," Arthur began, not bothering with pleasantries. "They're nervous. They see our expansion into the northern docks as a threat, not a partnership. We need a bond, something more permanent than a signed contract or a handshake in a backroom. We need blood and law to bind us." Elias kept his expression neutral, though a prickle of unease climbed his spine. "What are you suggesting? I've already secured their logistics routes. They have no reason to doubt our commitment." "Logistics can be sabotaged, Elias. Loyalty is fickle, but family is an anchor," Arthur said, turning to look him directly in the eye. "I've spoken with Julian. He's agreed to give his daughter Elena to the firm, or more specifically, to you." The air in the car suddenly felt thin. Elias felt a surge of heat beneath his collar. Marriage was a concept he had long ago discarded, a relic of a normal life he was never permitted to lead. To him, women were fleeting distractions, shadows that passed through his bed and left no trace by morning. He enjoyed the heat of a woman's body, the way skin felt against skin in the dark, the heavy scent of perfume and sweat, but he had never allowed a woman to see the man behind the enforcer. "She's 22, Elias. She's been kept away from the grime of our world. She's the image of purity the Marcellos want to protect, and you are the shield that will do it," Arthur continued, his tone clinical. "This isn't a request. This is the price of the crown you've been wearing. You marry her on the 20th of November. It solidifies the merger, ensures the Marcello's silent partners stay silent, and it puts you in line to take over the entire operation when I step down." Elias looked out the window as the car passed through the glittering neon-soaked streets of the West End. The architecture here was grand, imposing, and ancient, much like the expectations now being thrust upon him. He thought of the girl, Elena. He had seen her once at a distance, a fleeting glimpse of pale skin and dark hair at a funeral 3 years ago. She had looked like a porcelain doll, something to be kept in a glass case, far removed from the bloodied knuckles and rain-slicked alleys he called home. He felt a sudden, visceral memory of a woman he had known years ago, the way her breath had hitched when he touched the small of her back, the friction of her silk dress against his rough palms. He had pushed her away because he knew he would eventually break her. Now he was being ordered to take a wife he didn't know, a woman who would surely shrink from the touch of a man who smelled of gunpowder and rain. "Is she aware of this?" Elias asked, his voice low and dangerous. "She knows her duty," Arthur replied, "just as you know yours. This isn't about love, Elias. It's about the architecture of power. You will meet her tomorrow evening at the Marcello estate. Wear your best suit. Try to look like a man who hasn't just come from a warehouse floor." The car came to a stop in front of Elias's apartment building. He stepped out back into the cold, the rain now a persistent drizzle. As the sedan pulled away, Elias stood on the sidewalk, the weight of the announcement settling into his bones. He was 34, and for the first time in his life he felt a flicker of genuine fear. It wasn't the fear of death. He had faced that a dozen times. It was the fear of a different kind of intrusion. He walked up the stairs to his flat, his mind racing. He thought of the strategic alliance, the maps of the city, and the vaults of cash. But mostly, he thought of the silent penthouse that awaited him on his wedding night, and the porcelain doll who would be forced to share his bed. He didn't see a partner. He saw a victim of his own success. He saw a contract written in flesh. And as he unlocked his door, he realized that the merger had already begun to change the air he breathed, drawing him toward a threshold he had never intended to cross. The Marcello estate was located behind iron gates that looked more like the bars of a cage than a symbol of prestige. On the evening of October 15th, 2023, the air was exceptionally still, as if the heavy London fog had decided to settle permanently over the manicured lawns and stone gargoyles. Inside, the house was a cathedral of silence, decorated with Renaissance art and marble floors that echoed every footstep like a heartbeat. Elena Marcello sat in front of her vanity, staring at a reflection she barely recognized. At 22 years old, her beauty was of a rare, fragile variety. Skin the color of cream, dark hair that fell in soft waves to her waist, and eyes as deep and green as the Thames at twilight. She was dressed in a silk gown of deep emerald, a garment that clung to her curves with a subtle, dangerous elegance. Her father had always called her his little porcelain doll, a nickname that had once felt like a term of endearment, but now felt like a life sentence. Psychologically, Elena was a woman trapped between two worlds. She had been educated in the best schools, taught to speak 3 languages, and play the piano with a precision that bordered on mechanical. But beneath the polished surface, there was a reservoir of quiet defiance. She understood the world her father inhabited. She knew the business meetings were often precursors to burials, and the wealth she enjoyed was bought with the currency of fear. She had accepted her role as a pawn long ago, but the news of her engagement to Elias Thorne had felt like a physical blow. She knew of Elias. In her world, his name was whispered like a bogeyman used to keep unruly subordinates in line. He was the Wolf of Whitechapel, a man who solved problems with a silence that was louder than a gunshot. The thought of belonging to such a man, of being touched by hands that had surely broken bones, sent a shiver of pure, cold dread through her veins. A knock at the door signaled the end of her solitude. Her father, Julian Marcello, entered the room. He was a man who smelled of expensive tobacco and old secrets. "He is here, Elena," Julian said, his voice devoid of the warmth a father should offer a bride-to-be. "Remember your place. This alliance is the only thing standing between us and a war we cannot win. Be the woman I raised you to be." Eleanor stood, her legs feeling like lead. "I understand, Father." They descended the grand staircase to the dining room, where Elias Thorne was already waiting. He stood by the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He had traded his wool coat for a black silk suit that made him look like a shadow given form. When he turned to look at her, Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. He was more imposing than the stories suggested. His presence was a physical weight in the room, a raw, masculine energy that clashed violently with the refined surroundings. Dinner was a masterclass in uncomfortable silence. Julian and Arthur discussed territory and logistics, as if they were talking about weather patterns, while Eleanor and Elias sat opposite each other, a vast, invisible chasm between them. Elias didn't speak to her, not at first. He ate with a methodical efficiency, his eyes occasionally flickering toward her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Toward the end of the evening, Julian stood to lead Arthur to his study to finalize some paperwork. "Elias, why don't you take Elena to the conservatory? You should get to know the woman who will be carrying your name." The walk to the glass-walled conservatory was silent. The only sound was the rustle of Eleanor's silk dress and the heavy thud of Elias's leather shoes on the marble. Once inside, surrounded by exotic ferns and the scent of damp earth, Elias finally stopped. He turned to her, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "You're trembling," he said. His voice was deeper than she expected, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very center of her chest. "I'm not," she lied, though her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. Elias took a step toward her, closing the distance until she could smell the faint scent of rain and sandalwood that clung to him. He reached out, his large calloused hand hovering near her face, before he tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The contact was brief, but it felt like an electric shock. His skin was hot, his touch unexpectedly gentle despite the power she knew he possessed. He tilted her chin up with his thumb, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes weren't cold now, they were searching, examining her, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Eleanor felt a strange, terrifying heat blossom in her stomach, a mixture of fear and an involuntary, primal attraction she didn't want to acknowledge. "You look like you're waiting for me to strike you," Elias murmured, his thumb grazing the soft line of her jaw. "Is that what they told you I do?" "They told me you are a man who gets what he wants," Elena whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't want this," he admitted, his eyes darkening. "But now that you're here, I realize that Arthur was right about one thing. You are a treasure, but a treasure in a house like this is just a target." He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her temple. The proximity was overwhelming. She could see the faint lines around his eyes, the rugged texture of his skin, and the raw strength in his neck. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, a formal cold seal of the contract, but he simply stepped back, the warmth of his hand leaving her skin feeling suddenly chilled. "The wedding is set for the 20th of November, Elias said, his tone returning to its professional, detached clip. "Until then you will stay here. My men will be stationed at the gates, not to keep you in, but to keep the world out." He turned and walked away without a backward glance, leaving Elena standing alone among the shadows of the conservatory. She touched her jaw where his thumb had rested, the ghost of his heat still lingering on her skin. She was 22, and in 5 weeks she would be bound to a man who lived in the darkness. She realized then that she wasn't just a sacrifice for her family's safety. She was stepping into a fire she had no hope of extinguishing, and the wedding night loomed on the horizon like a storm that promised to change everything she thought she knew about herself. The date was November 20th, 2023, and the city of London was a blur of neon lights and freezing rain outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite. The wedding had been a grand, hollow spectacle, a union of 2 empires conducted in a cathedral that felt more like a courtroom. Elias Thorne had spent the day standing like a statue of salt, enduring the handshakes of men he didn't trust and the watchful eyes of the Marcello family. Now the heavy oak doors of the master suite had finally closed, locking out the world and leaving him alone with the woman who was officially his wife. The penthouse was a monument to modern excess, all cold marble and sharp angles, but the atmosphere inside was thick with a tension that felt almost tactile. Elias had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the corded muscles of his neck and the dark ink of a tattoo that peeked out from his chest. He poured himself a glass of neat scotch, the liquid amber glowing under the recessed lighting. He didn't look at Elena yet. He couldn't. He was a man who lived by a code of predictable outcomes, and for the first time in his 34 years, he felt entirely out of his depth. Elena stood by the window, her back to him. She was still wearing her wedding gown, a masterpiece of lace and silk that seemed to glow in the dim light. Her shoulders were delicate, moving slightly with her shallow, nervous breaths. Elias watched her through the reflection in the glass. She looked like a captive bird, beautiful and terrified. "The champagne is on ice," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to startle her. "But I suspect you've had enough of celebrating a contract." Elena turned slowly, her hands trembling as she clutched the fabric of her skirt. The makeup she had worn for the ceremony had been washed away, leaving her face pale and her green eyes wide. "I didn't think you'd want to talk," she whispered. Elias set his glass down on the marble counter. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the thick rug. He stopped just inches away, the heat from his body radiating toward her. He could smell the scent of lilies and vanilla that clung to her skin, a soft, feminine aroma that felt dangerously out of place in his world of gunpowder and asphalt. "I'm not a monster, Elena," he murmured, reaching out to trace the line of her collarbone with his thumb. Her skin was incredibly soft, like rose petals under his calloused touch. "I know why you're here. I know what they expect of us tonight." He felt her heart racing beneath his palm as he moved his hand to the small of her back, pulling her incrementally closer. The friction of her silk dress against his trousers sent a jolt of raw, primal electricity through him. Elena let out a soft, shaky breath, her head tilting back as she looked up at him. There was no revulsion in her eyes, only a deep, searching vulnerability that made Elias's chest tighten. He leaned down, his lips grazing the sensitive skin behind her ear. He felt her shiver, a delicate tremor that seemed to ripple through her entire body. "You don't have to do anything you aren't ready for," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Eleanor's hands moved to his chest, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. "I am your wife, Elias. I know what my duty is." The word duty tasted like ash in his mouth. He didn't want a transaction. He wanted the fire he felt simmering beneath the surface. He moved his hand to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her dark hair as he pulled her into a kiss. It was meant to be a claim, a hard and dominant seal of his ownership, but the moment their lips met, the dynamic shifted. Her mouth was soft and hesitant, tasting of sweet wine and nerves. She responded with a desperate, unpracticed hunger that caught him off guard. He lifted her easily, her legs wrapping around his waist as he carried her toward the expansive bed. The silk of her gown rustled loudly in the silence. As he laid her down against the dark sheets, the contrast of her pale skin and the white lace against the charcoal fabric was breathtaking. Elias moved with a deliberate slowness, his hands exploring the curves of her body through the thin layers of her dress. Every touch was an interrogation, every groan she let out a revelation. He began to unlace the back of her gown, his large fingers working with unexpected patience. When the fabric finally fell away, revealing the smooth expanse of her back and the swell of her breasts, Elias felt a surge of protectiveness that warred with his desire. He moved his hands over her skin, feeling the heat of her blood beneath the surface. The intimacy was intense, a heavy, suffocating blanket of shared breath and skin-to-skin contact. But as the night progressed, as the initial rush of adrenaline began to settle into the rhythmic dance of two bodies becoming one, Elias felt a change in the air. He felt her hesitation, not out of fear of him, but out of a profound, untouched mystery. He pulled back for a moment, his eyes searching hers in the moonlight that spilled through the window. "Elena," he whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, sharp realization. The truth revealed itself in the way she looked at him, with a purity that was entirely foreign to his world. Elias Thorne, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, who had spent his life in the company of women who were as cynical as he was suddenly confronted with a treasure he hadn't believed existed. The revelation of her virginity wasn't just a physical fact, it was a spiritual blow. It shattered the cold, clinical walls he had built around his heart. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a pawn or a contract, but a woman who had been kept apart for this very moment. The weight of her innocence felt like a heavy stone in his gut. He realized that by taking her, he was marking her forever, not just with his name, but with the darkness of his life. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his breath hitching. The sensual heat of the room was replaced by a profound, terrifying emotional connection. He felt a fierce, burning need to protect her, not just from his enemies, but from himself. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice raw. "I didn't think it mattered to a man like you," she replied, her voice small but steady. Elias closed his eyes, his fingers tightening in the sheets. He realized then that his wedding night wasn't the end of a merger. It was the beginning of a war he wasn't sure he could win. A war for his own soul, fought in the silence of a penthouse overlooking a city that never stopped watching. The morning of November 25th, 2023, arrived with a pale, sickly sun that struggled to pierce the thick layer of smog hanging over the Thames. Inside the penthouse, the atmosphere had shifted from a cold vacuum to something dense and complicated. Elias Thorne stood at the kitchen island, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and old scars. He was watching Elena. She was sitting at the glass table, dressed in a silk robe of midnight blue that slipped slightly off one shoulder. She was reading a book, but her eyes hadn't moved across the page in several minutes. Since their wedding night 5 days ago, a fragile bridge had been built between them, one made of whispered conversations in the dark and the lingering heat of physical discovery. For Elias, the revelation of her innocence had been a seismic event. He found himself looking at his own hands and seeing the blood they had spilled, then looking at her and feeling a desperate, clawing need to keep that blood far away from her. He walked over to her, his movements fluid and silent. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his thumb grazing the soft skin of her neck. He felt her lean into his touch, a small gesture of trust that felt more significant than any oath of loyalty he had ever received. The friction of his calloused thumb against her velvet-smooth skin created a spark of warmth that settled deep in his chest. "You're quiet today," he murmured, his voice low and raspy from sleep. Elena turned her head, her lips brushing against the side of his hand. "I was just thinking about how different the world looks from up here. It's so quiet. Down there it feels like everyone is screaming." Elias looked out at the sprawling city. To him, London was a beast that needed to be fed, a collection of territories to be managed, and debts to be collected. But seeing it through her eyes made the concrete look sharper, the shadows longer. He leaned down, his lips ghosting over the crown of her head. The scent of her, lilies and something uniquely her own, swirled around him, a temporary sanctuary from the grime of his reality. "Stay up here today," Elias said, his tone shifting to the authoritative clip of a man used to giving orders. "I have meetings at the club. The merger is entering the second phase and the Vane brothers are getting restless." "Are you in danger?" she asked, her green eyes searching his. Elias straightened his back, the enforcer's mask sliding back into place. "I am the danger, Elena, don't forget that." He left the penthouse 30 minutes later, his charcoal coat buttoned tight. He climbed into the back of a black SUV where Arthur was waiting, the elder man's face a mask of calculated indifference. As they drove through the narrow, rain-slicked streets of Shoreditch, Elias felt a strange disconnect. Usually, his mind was a sharp blade, focused entirely on the logistics of the day. But now, a part of him remained in the penthouse, anchored to the woman who was currently the only pure thing in his life. They arrived at a private club, a place where the air was thick with the smell of expensive cognac and the quiet murmurs of men who decided the fates of neighborhoods. As Elias walked through the room, he felt the weight of eyes on him. The underworld was a sensitive ecosystem. Any change in a predator's behavior was sensed immediately. He sat down at a mahogany table opposite Silas Vane, a younger, more volatile player in the city's power structure. Silas had slicked back hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He looked at Elias with a mocking curiosity. "Congratulations on the nuptials, Thorne," Silas said, leaning back and lighting a cigarette. I hear the Marcello girl is a real prize. A bit delicate for a man of your robust tastes, isn't she? Elias felt a surge of cold fury, but he kept his expression as still as a frozen pond. He leaned forward, his presence filling the space between them like a physical threat. The Marcello girl is my wife, Silas, and I would suggest you keep her name out of your mouth if you'd like to keep your teeth in yours. The room went silent. Silas's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. He knew Elias's reputation, but he also saw something new in the older man's eyes, a fierce, protective spark that hadn't been there a month ago. To Silas, this wasn't a sign of strength. It was a target. "Just making conversation," Silas muttered, though he looked away. The meeting lasted for 3 hours, a tedious back and forth about protection rackets and territory boundaries. By the time Elias stepped back out into the London drizzle, his jaw was tight with tension. He walked toward the SUV, but a movement in a nearby alley caught his eye. He signaled for his driver to wait and stepped into the shadows. Nailed to a wooden crate was a single, white lily, the same flower that had decorated his wedding, and the scent that clung to Elena's skin. The petals were bruised and blackened, as if they had been stepped on. Attached to the stem was a small handwritten note on expensive cardstock. "A treasure is only valuable as long as it remains unbroken. Be careful where you leave your shield, Wolf." The message was clear. His rivals hadn't just noticed his change in demeanor. They had identified the source of it. The merger was no longer just about business. It had become a game of leverage, and Elena was the most valuable piece on the board. Elias crumpled the note in his fist, his knuckles turning white. He felt the old, familiar coldness of the enforcer returning, but it was now sharpened by a new, desperate kind of violence. He realized that the penthouse was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress under siege. As he climbed back into the car, his mind began to map out the city again, but this time he wasn't looking for territory. He was looking for every man who knew his wife's name, and he was deciding exactly how they would bleed for it. He looked at his phone, his thumb hovering over Elena's name. He wanted to call her, to hear her voice, but he knew that any connection now was a vulnerability. The cracks in the concrete were widening, and the world he had spent 15 years building was beginning to tremble beneath the weight of a secret he could no longer hide. The rain had turned into a rhythmic drumming against the reinforced glass of the penthouse by the evening of November 26, 2023. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of expensive beeswax candles and the faint, lingering aroma of the dinner Elena had prepared. Elias Thorne stood in the doorway of their bedroom, his frame casting a long, jagged shadow across the plush carpet. He had spent the last 4 hours scouring the city, his mind a whirlwind of names and faces, trying to determine who had left that bruised lily in the alley. He watched Elena as she sat at the edge of the bed, brushing her long, dark hair. She was wearing a silk slip that was the color of a bruised plum, the fabric clinging to the curve of her hips and the soft swell of her breasts. Every movement she made was graceful, almost hypnotic. Elias felt a familiar, sharp tug in his gut, a mixture of possessive desire and a terrifying vulnerability. He walked toward her, his footsteps swallowed by the rug. "You're back late," she said, her voice soft, not looking up from her reflection. "Business ran long," Elias replied, his voice a low rumble. He reached her and placed his hands on her bare shoulders. The contrast was startling. His hands were massive, scarred, and dark against the ivory perfection of her skin. He felt her breath hitch, her body leaning back into his strength. He slid his hands down her arms, the friction of his calloused palms against her silk-smooth skin sending a jolt of heat through both of them. He leaned down, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply, seeking the scent of lilies that usually brought him peace, but tonight it only reminded him of the threat. He pressed a hard, lingering kiss to the sensitive chord of her throat, his teeth grazing her skin, just enough to make her gasp. "Elias," she whispered, her hands coming up to cover his. "You're tense. What happened today?" "Nothing you need to worry about," he lied, his fingers tightening slightly on her arms before he pulled away. He couldn't let her see the cracks in his armor. He couldn't let her know that she was the reason he was suddenly looking over his shoulder. He walked into his private study, a room filled with leather-bound books he never read, and monitors that fed him a constant stream of surveillance from his various properties. He sat in the darkness, the blue light of the screens reflecting in his cold eyes. His mind drifted back unbidden to a different rain-soaked night, September 12, 2008. Back then, Elias had been 20 years old, a hungry soldier with everything to prove. He had a partner, a man named Marcus, who had been like a brother to him. They had shared everything, stolen cars, cheap whiskey, and dreams of one day running the East End. But on that night, Marcus had led him into an ambush at a shipyard in exchange for a £10,000 payout from a rival crew. Elias had survived barely, but the betrayal had left a deeper scar than the bullet that had grazed his ribs. He had hunted Marcus down 2 weeks later and finished him in a cold, silent alleyway. That was the day Elias Thorne stopped believing in loyalty. Now, 15 years later, the ghost of that betrayal was whispering in his ear again. He began to review the security logs for the penthouse and the club. He looked at the movements of his inner circle. Men he had known for a decade, men who had bled for him. He cross-referenced their phone pings with the time the lily had been placed in the alley. His eyes narrowed as he noticed a discrepancy. Thomas, his primary driver and a man who had been with the firm for 12 years, had been out of range for 45 minutes during the time of the meeting with Silas Vane. It was a small window, easily explained by a dead zone or a technical glitch, but in Elias's world there were no coincidences. A knock at the door broke his concentration. It was Arthur. The older man walked in without waiting for an invitation, his face unreadable. "You've been quiet today, Elias," Arthur said, taking a seat in one of the leather armchairs. "The Marcellos are asking questions. They want to know why you've increased the guard around the girl." "I don't like the way Silas Vane looks at her," Elias said, his voice clipped. "Silas is a dog who barks at anything shiny," Arthur dismissed. "But there's something else, isn't there? You found something." Elias debated whether to tell him about the note. Arthur was his mentor, but Arthur was also the architect of this merger. If there was a leak, Elias couldn't be sure where it started. "Just a feeling," Elias said. Arthur leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Feelings are for poets, Elias. In this business, we deal in certainties. Don't let your attachment to the girl cloud your judgment. She was a bridge, nothing more. If that bridge becomes a liability, you know what has to be done." The implication was clear, and it made Elias's blood run cold. He thought of Elena's innocence, the way she had looked at him on their wedding night, and the way her body felt against his. To Arthur, she was a piece of paper to be shredded if the deal went south. After Arthur left, Elias went back to the logs. He dug deeper into Thomas's history, looking for anything he might have missed. He found a series of offshore deposits made 3 months ago, just as the merger talks were beginning. The amounts were small, designed to stay under the radar, but the source was a shell company linked to the Marcello family's silent partners. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The betrayal wasn't just coming from his own men, it was rooted in the very family he had married into. His marriage hadn't been a merger of 2 empires, it had been a setup, a way to place a target in his bed and a traitor at his side. The Judas kiss wasn't just a metaphor, it was the air he was breathing. Elias stood up and walked back into the bedroom. Elena was asleep, her dark hair splayed across the white pillows like silk threads. She looked so peaceful, so entirely unaware of the storm that was about to break over her head. He sat on the edge of the bed and touched her cheek, his hand trembling slightly. He had spent 15 years building a wall around himself, ensuring that no one could ever get close enough to hurt him again. And in one night, one unexpected treasure had bypassed all his defenses. He realized then that he couldn't just be the enforcer anymore. He had to be a ghost again. He pulled a small encrypted burner phone from his nightstand and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "It's Thorne," he said when the line connected. "I need the cleaner, and I need a secure location outside the city. The game has changed." As he hung up, he looked down at Elena. The cracks in the concrete were no longer just visible, the whole foundation was crumbling. He had to decide who to kill and who to save, and for the first time in his life, the answer wasn't written in blood. It was written in the way she breathed in her sleep, a rhythmic, fragile promise that he was willing to burn the whole of London to keep. The morning of November 27th, 2023, arrived with a sky the colour of a bruised plum, heavy with the promise of a storm that had been brewing over the English Channel for days. Inside the penthouse, the air was unnervingly still. Elias Thorne stood by the heavy mahogany dresser, checking the weight of the semi-automatic pistol he tucked into the small of his back. He moved with a mechanical precision, his face a mask of cold, unyielding stone. He had spent the previous night in a state of hypervigilance, his ears tuned to every creak of the building and every whistle of the wind against the glass. Eleanor was in the kitchen, her fingers trembling as she poured coffee into 2 ceramic mugs. She was dressed in a simple, elegant wool coat of charcoal grey, a garment Elias had chosen for her because it was inconspicuous. She looked smaller today, the vibrant spark she had shown on their wedding night dimmed by the palpable tension radiating from her husband. She didn't ask questions. She had lived her entire life in the shadow of men like Julian Marcello, and she knew when the air was thick with the scent of an impending execution. "We're leaving," Elias said, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly register that signaled he was no longer the husband, but the enforcer. "I'm driving myself today. Thomas is occupied elsewhere." Elena met his gaze, her green eyes searching the depths of his cold grey irises. "Where are we going, Elias?" "Somewhere the walls don't have ears," he replied, walking toward her. He reached out, his hand cupping the side of her face. The friction of his calloused thumb against her soft cheek was the only warmth in the room. He felt her lean into his palm, a tiny, desperate gesture of seeking anchor in a rising tide. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the chilly morning air. "Trust me, Elena. That's all I need from you today." "I do," she whispered, and for a fleeting second, Elias felt a pang of genuine agony. Her trust was a weight more significant than the weapon at his hip. They descended to the underground garage in a silence that felt like a held breath. Elias bypassed the usual luxury sedans and opted for a nondescript armoured SUV, a vehicle built for survival rather than status. As they pulled out into the London traffic, the city felt like a labyrinth of potential traps. Every delivery van, every cyclist, and every pedestrian with their head down against the rain was a variable to be calculated. Elias drove with a focused intensity, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors. They moved through the narrow, winding streets of Southwark, the Victorian brickwork rising up like canyon walls on either side of them. The architecture here was a jumble of the ancient and the modern, glass-fronted offices, standing shoulder to shoulder, with soot-stained warehouses that had seen the turn of the century. "We're being followed," Elias said calmly, as they crossed the Blackfriars Bridge. Elena's head snapped toward the side mirror. "Where? I don't see—" "2 cars back, the silver sedan. It's been with us since the roundabout," Elias interrupted, his voice devoid of emotion. "Keep your head down. Don't look at them. Just stay calm." He accelerated, the powerful engine of the SUV growling as he threaded through a gap in the heavy traffic. The silver sedan mirrored his move, its tires splashing through deep puddles of grey water. Elias felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the cold clarity that only came when his life was on the line. But this time the stakes were different. He wasn't just protecting a shipment or a reputation. He was protecting the woman whose hand was now gripped tightly onto the leather of her seat. They turned off the main thoroughfare into a derelict industrial estate near the docks. The rain was coming down in sheets now, obscuring the horizon and turning the concrete into a mirror. Suddenly a black van lunged from a side alley, its front bumper slamming into the side of the SUV with a bone-jarring impact. The world turned into a blur of screaming metal and shattering glass. Elias fought the steering wheel as the SUV spun, his muscles straining against the force of the collision. They came to a halt against a rusted shipping container, the air heavy with the smell of burnt rubber and leaking coolant. "Stay down!" Elias roared, his hand already reaching for the pistol at his back. The silver sedan screeched to a halt behind them, and 4 men stepped out, their faces obscured by balaclavas. They were carrying submachine guns, the matte black barrels gleaming in the rain. Before the first shot was fired, Elias kicked his door open and rolled out into the wet asphalt, using the engine block as cover. The sound of gunfire was deafening, a rhythmic staccato chatter that echoed off the surrounding warehouses. Elias returned fire with a surgical precision, his shots aimed at the muzzle flashes in the gloom. He saw one of the gunmen crumple to the ground, but the others continued their advance, their bullets stitching a line of holes across the SUV's reinforced body. Inside the car, Elena was curled into a ball on the floorboards, her hands over her ears. She could hear the glass of the passenger window cracking, the spider web of fractures spreading with every impact. The smell of gunpowder was acrid and suffocating. This was the world she had only heard about in whispers, the true, unvarnished brutality of the Thorn firm. Her husband wasn't a man who solved problems with words. He was a man who spoke in lead and blood. Elias saw a gap in their formation. He lunged from behind the car, moving with a speed that defied his size. He was the wolf now, a predator in his natural habitat. He closed the distance to the second gunman, his movements a blur of practiced violence. He caught the man's wrist, the bone snapping with a sickening crack, and used him as a human shield as he fired at the remaining two. The skirmish lasted less than 2 minutes, but to Elena, it felt like an eternity. When the silence finally returned, it was punctuated only by the heavy drumming of the rain and the distant, fading wail of a siren. Elias stood in the middle of the alley, his chest heaving, his face splattered with rain and a fine mist of red. He looked down at the bodies on the ground with a detached coldness that chilled Elena to her marrow. He wasn't a hero. He was a survivor who had mastered the art of destruction. He walked back to the SUV and pulled the door open. He reached inside, his hands slick with water as he grabbed Elena by the shoulders and pulled her out. She was shaking violently, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice harsh. He began checking her body with a frantic, rough efficiency, his hands moving over her arms, her torso, and her legs. "I'm fine," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "Elias, your face, there's blood." "It's not mine," he said, and the flatness of his tone was more terrifying than the gunfire. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her with a possessive, crushing strength. He buried his face in her hair, the scent of her lilies now mixed with the metallic tang of blood and the dampness of the storm. For a moment, they stood there in the wreckage, two souls bound by a contract and a sudden, violent reality. Eleanor looked over his shoulder at the man he had killed. The realization hit her then. She wasn't just his wife. She was his accomplice. She was the reason he was fighting, and he was the reason she was still breathing. The line between protection and imprisonment had vanished. Elias pulled back, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, dark intensity. He saw the fear in her gaze, and he saw the way she looked at him, no longer as the mysterious husband, but as the man who brought death to his doorstep. He felt a sharp, agonizing twist in his heart. He had a choice to make. He could push her away, find a way to annul the marriage and send her into hiding, or he could pull her so deep into his world that the shadows would never let her go. "We have to move," he said, his voice regaining its steel. "They know where we are. This was just the beginning." He led her toward a secondary vehicle he had stashed in a nearby garage, a nondescript sedan that looked like 1,000 others in the city. As they drove away from the carnage, leaving the bodies of the Marcello and Vane enforcers to the rain, Elias kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other gripped tightly around Elena's hand. The fragile shield had broken, and as the London skyline blurred behind them, Elias realized that the girl he had married was gone. In her place was a woman who had seen the wolf, and as he glanced at her pale, determined profile, he wondered if he had saved her life only to destroy her soul, leaving a lingering question hanging in the cold, damp air of the car as they sped toward a destiny neither of them could escape. The safe house was a converted loft in a part of the city where the streetlights were perpetually flickering and the air tasted of salt and rusted iron. On the evening of November 28th, 2023, the interior was bathed in the amber glow of a single lamp. Elias Thorne stood by the heavy steel door, his gaze fixed on Elena. She was sitting on a threadbare sofa, wrapped in his oversized wool sweater, her legs pulled up to her chest. The trauma of the previous day had left her pale, but there was a new, hard edge to the set of her jaw that Elias hadn't seen before. He walked toward her, his heavy boots silent on the wooden floorboards. The adrenaline from the ambush had finally ebbed, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He had spent the last 12 hours on a burner phone, weaving a web of misinformation and false promises. He had reached out to Silas Vane and the silent partners of the Marcello Group, offering a peace summit at a neutral location, a high-end hotel in the heart of the city where the architecture was all glass and accountability. He had told them he was ready to negotiate a new deal, one that didn't involve the messy entanglement of a marriage. "You're going to leave me here," Eleanor said, her voice steady, despite the slight tremor in her hands. Elias stopped in front of her and knelt down, placing his hands on her knees. The friction of his calloused palms against the soft wool of the sweater sent a jolt of protective heat through him. He moved his hands upward, tracing the curve of her thighs until he reached the hem of the sweater. He felt her breath hitch as his fingertips grazed the bare skin of her legs. Even in the middle of a war, the physical pull between them was an undeniable magnetic force. "Only for a few hours," Elias murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "I've tripled the guard outside. Nobody knows about this place except for the cleaner, and he's been on my payroll since the year 2009. He moved his hands to her waist, pulling her forward until she was at the edge of the sofa, her face inches from his. He could see the faint gold flecks in her green eyes and the way her lower lip trembled. He reached up, his large hand cupping the back of her head, his fingers tangling in the dark silk-like strands of her hair. He pulled her into a kiss that was desperate and hungry, a silent plea for forgiveness for the world he had dragged her into. Elena responded with a fierce intensity, her hands clutching at his shoulders, her nails digging into the leather of his jacket. The kiss tasted of coffee and unresolved fear. Elias felt the heat of her body radiating through the thin fabric of her slip beneath the sweater, the contrast of her soft curves against his hard, scarred frame, creating a sensory overload. He moved his lips to her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "When I come back," he whispered, "everything changes. No more secrets, no more shadows." "Just come back, Elias," she whispered back, her voice breaking. He stood up, the enforcer's mask sliding back into place. He checked his reflection in a darkened window, black suit, black tie, and a face that looked as though it had been forged in the very fires of the East End. He wasn't just a gangster tonight, he was a man protecting his treasure. The meeting was set for 9 in the evening. Elias arrived at the hotel, a towering monolith of steel and glass that overlooked the dark, winding ribbon of the Thames. The lobby was a cathedral of artificial light and hushed conversations. He took the private elevator to the top floor, where a secluded boardroom had been prepared. As the doors opened, he was met by the sight of Silas Vane, Julian Marcello, and 3 other men he recognized as the silent financiers behind the merger. They were sitting around a table made of obsidian, their faces illuminated by the cold blue light of the city skyline behind them. "The wolf finally decides to talk," Silas sneered, leaning back and blowing a plume of cigar smoke into the air. "We thought you'd be too busy playing nursemaid to your little bride." Elias sat at the head of the table, his presence immediately shifting the gravity of the room. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at Julian, his father-in-law. "I know about the offshore accounts, Julian. I know about the payments to Thomas. You didn't want a merger. You wanted a hostile takeover with a convenient scapegoat." Julian's face went the color of ash. "Elias, you don't understand the pressures we were under." "I understand everything," Elias interrupted, his voice like the click of a hammer on a loaded chamber. "I understand that you sold your daughter to a man you thought you could control, and I understand that you underestimated exactly how much I am willing to burn to keep what is mine." Elias leaned forward, placing a small black device on the table. "This is a digital ledger. It contains every transaction, every communication, and every recorded conversation regarding this merger and the subsequent accidents that have occurred over the last week. If I don't enter a deactivation code every 60 minutes, this data is automatically uploaded to the Metropolitan Police and the Internal Revenue Service." The room went deathly silent. Silas Vane's smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The financiers looked at each other, their calculated risks suddenly turning into a guaranteed loss. "You're bluffing," Silas hissed, though his voice lacked conviction. "Try me," Elias challenged, his eyes as cold and unforgiving as the London winter. "But before you decide, you should know that my men are currently standing outside each of your homes. They aren't there to talk. They are waiting for a signal. If I walk out of here with a signed dissolution of the merger and a full transfer of the Northern Dock Territories to my personal holding company, the signal never comes. If I don't, well, we all know how the stories about the wolf end." The Iron Gambit was in motion. Elias wasn't just playing for money or power. He was playing for the right to exist outside the cage Arthur and Julian had built for him. He watched as the men scrambled to find a way out of the trap he had laid with 15 years of experience and 3 days of desperation. He thought of Elena back in the loft, the way the light had caught the gold in her eyes. He thought of the treasure he had found on his wedding night, the unexpected purity that had given him a reason to fight for something more than just survival. "Sign the papers," Julian whispered, his voice defeated. As the pens moved across the parchment, Elias felt a strange, hollow sensation in his chest. He had won. He had secured the wealth, the territory, and the safety of the woman he loved. But as he looked out at the glittering, indifferent lights of the city, he realized that the cost of this victory was his complete and total exile from the only world he had ever known. He was no longer the enforcer for the firm. He was a king without a kingdom, a man standing on the precipice of a new, terrifying freedom. He took the signed documents and stood up, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had one more move to make, the most dangerous one of all. He walked toward the elevator, but as the doors began to close, he saw Silas Vane reaching for a phone, his eyes burning with a vengeful, desperate light. Elias knew the game wasn't over. The trap had sprung, but the prey was still thrashing. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Elias realized that the night of blood and strategy had one final lethal chapter remaining, and the transition from gangster to husband was going to require a sacrifice he wasn't sure he was ready to make, leaving the air in the small moving box thick with the scent of an impending storm that would wash away the last of the concrete and leave only the raw, aching truth of the man beneath the suit. The rain had finally ceased by the early hours of November 29th, 2023, leaving the city of London draped in a heavy, suffocating fog that muffled the sounds of the waking world. Elias Thorne stood on the curb outside the luxury hotel, the signed documents pressed against his chest like a shield. He didn't wait for the valet. He stepped into the shadows of a side street, his hand resting on the grip of the pistol at his back. He knew Silas Vane's call would have set the vultures in motion. The Iron Gambit had won him the war on paper, but the streets didn't care about ink and signatures. He reached his backup vehicle, a rugged silver sedan parked 3 blocks away, and tore through the city with a controlled desperation. Every headlight in his rearview mirror felt like a threat, every siren a herald of his own undoing. His mind was a frantic map of escape routes and contingency plans, but at the center of it all was Elena. She was the anchor that kept him from drifting into the abyss of his own violent history. When he reached the safe house, he took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He burst through the steel door, his weapon drawn, only to find the loft bathed in the pale, grey light of dawn. Elena was standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the mist. She turned, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. When she saw him, she let out a sob that seemed to tear through the very air between them. Elias dropped his gun on the table and crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms with a strength that was almost painful. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of lilies that had become his only oxygen. He felt her hands clutching at his back, her fingers tracing the tension in his muscles. "Is it over?" she whispered into his chest. "It's over," Elias replied, his voice a ragged, hollow echo of its former self. "The merger is dead. Your father is neutralized. We have the Northern Territories and enough capital to disappear 10 times over." He pulled back, his hands cupping her face. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman who had transformed him. She wasn't just a girl he had found in a glass cage. She was the architect of his redemption. He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep connection that tasted of salt and the promise of a future he hadn't believed he deserved. The friction of his rough palms against her jaw was a reminder of the man he was, while the softness of her lips was a promise of the man he could become. They didn't stay to celebrate. By 6 in the morning, they were in a different car, heading south toward the coast. Elias watched the London skyline recede in the distance. The Shard, the Gherkin, the ancient soot-stained steeples of the East End. He had spent 15 years building a kingdom in those shadows, and he was leaving it all behind, without a single regret. He wasn't renouncing the wealth or the power, he was simply changing the currency. They reached a secluded villa on the outskirts of a coastal town 3 hours later. The architecture here was different: white stone, open terraces, and the endless blue expanse of the English Channel. It was a place where the air didn't taste of smoke, and the silence wasn't a precursor to violence. Inside the villa, the morning sun poured through the open windows, casting long golden streaks across the floor. Elias stood on the terrace, watching the waves crash against the cliffs. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Elena. She was wearing one of his white shirts, the fabric billowing slightly in the sea breeze. Her skin looked luminous in the natural light, the bruises of the last few days beginning to fade into memory. He pulled her close, his arm wrapping around her waist. He felt the curve of her hip against his thigh, the warmth of her body a constant grounding reality. He moved his hand to the small of her back, his fingers tracing the delicate line of her spine. The intimacy was different now. It wasn't driven by the frantic need of the hunted, but by the steady burning coal of a deep-rooted connection. "What do we do now?" she asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We live," Elias said, the word feeling strange and heavy on his tongue. "For the first time in 34 years, I don't have to be a wolf. I don't have to be an enforcer. I just have to be yours." He turned her in his arms, his gaze dropping to her lips. He felt the familiar magnetic pull, the raw sensuality that had defined their relationship from that first shocking night in the penthouse. He leaned down, his mouth catching hers in a kiss that was both a thank you and a vow. He felt her hands slide into his hair, her body molding itself to his with a confidence that made his breath hitch. As the sun rose higher over the water, Elias Thorne realized that his life hadn't been a tragedy, but a long, difficult journey toward this single moment of peace. He had spent his youth chasing a crown of salt and stone, only to find that the greatest wealth a man could possess was the chance to be seen, truly seen, by the one person who could handle his darkness without being consumed by it. The city of London would continue to burn, its secrets buried beneath the rain and the concrete. New kings would rise, and new enforcers would walk the rain-slicked alleys of Whitechapel. But Elias and Elena were ghosts now, living in a world of their own making. Resilience wasn't just about surviving the storm, it was about having the courage to walk out of the wreckage and build something beautiful from the ruins. As Elias looked at his wife, the unexpected treasure of his life, he knew that the war was finally won. He wasn't a gangster anymore. He was a man who had found his soul in the silence of a wedding night, and as the waves whispered against the shore, he realized that the best stories don't end with a bang, but with the quiet, rhythmic breathing of two people who finally found their way home.